I never imagined that my life could change so drastically in such a short period. Just a year ago, everything seemed perfect. I had a great job, a loving family, and friends who filled my days with laughter. I felt on top of the world. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter on me, and I couldn't stop counting my daily blessings. There was a sense of peace that enveloped me. But then, like an unexpected storm, my life took a turn I wasn't ready for. It started with a piece of news that shattered the calm I had been living in. My husband, Paul, was laid off from his job. At first, we didn't panic. We'd been through tough times before, and this seemed like just another bump in the road. But weeks turned into months, and the weight of financial strain began to suffocate us. Bills piled up, and our savings dwindled. What was once a life of joy and gratitude quickly spiraled into sleepless nights filled with anxiety and desperation. I tried to stay positive, keeping a mindset that things would eventually turn around. But it became harder with each passing day. Paul fell into a deep depression, withdrawing from me and the kids. I could feel my own faith weakening, the spiritual growth I once cherished slipping away. Where was God in all of this? Why was this happening to us? I clung to hope, but it felt like I was grasping at air. I prayed for peace, for answers, but all I felt was silence. One night, after another argument about our mounting debt, I found myself alone in the living room. The weight of everything crashed down on me, and I felt utterly defeated. Tears streamed down my face, and I cried out to God in a way I hadn't done in years. It wasn't a polite, rehearsed prayer. It was raw, desperate, and full of pain. God, where are you? Please, I need you. I can't do this alone. I need a sign, something to show me that you're still here. I don't know how long I sat there, sobbing into the silence, but eventually, a calmness washed over me. It was as if someone had placed a warm blanket over my shoulders, offering me comfort in a way that words couldn't. I wiped my eyes, feeling a small spark of hope rekindled. Maybe God hadn't left me. Maybe I had been too busy focusing on the storm to see His presence in the midst of it. That night was a turning point. I knew I couldn't control what was happening around me, but I could control how I responded to it. I began setting aside time every morning for what I called my quiet time with the Lord. It was a space where I could reflect, breathe, and focus on the good energy that still existed in my life. I started keeping a gratitude journal, listing the daily blessings that were often overshadowed by the chaos. Slowly, my peace returned. Each morning became my sanctuary. I would sit in the corner of our small living room, where the early morning light would filter through the window, casting a soft glow over everything. It was in those quiet moments that I truly began to feel the presence of God again. At first, I didn't expect much, just a little time to clear my mind before the day's struggles hit me. But what I found was so much deeper. As I prayed and reflected, I felt the weight of my burdens lift, piece by piece. It wasn't that our financial problems disappeared overnight, but my heart was changing. I was finding joy again, not in my circumstances, but in the simple act of connecting with the Lord. Paul, on the other hand, was still struggling. I could see the pain in his eyes every day, the sense of failure that had wrapped itself around him. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was with short, frustrated sentences. There were times when I wanted to shake him, to remind him that we weren't alone in this, that we still had our faith, our family, and so much to be grateful for. But I knew that his journey would be different from mine. He wasn't ready yet. He wasn't seeing the small miracles like I was. One morning, while I was in my quiet time, I prayed specifically for Paul. I asked God to reach him, to lift him out of the darkness that had swallowed him. As I sat there, the thought occurred to me, maybe I was the one who needed to be the light for him. Maybe God was calling me to lead, to show Paul that despite everything, there was still hope. It wasn't an easy realization. I had been waiting for God to fix things, but perhaps I needed to take a more active role in our healing. That evening, instead of asking Paul about job searches or bills, I suggested we take a walk. It was something we used to do all the time before life became so overwhelming. At first, he resisted, but after a bit of gentle nudging, he agreed. We walked in silence for most of it, but something about being outside, away from the suffocating tension of the house, seemed to ease him. I could feel a shift, subtle but real. As we walked, I told him about my morning rituals, about how I had been reconnecting with God, and how much it had helped me find peace in the middle of our chaos. For the first time in weeks, he listened. Really listened. I told him about the gratitude journal, about how focusing on the good, even the smallest things, had brought me back to a place of joy and faith. By the time we got home, he wasn't saying much, but I could tell something had changed in him too. Over the next few weeks, we began walking together more often. Paul didn't immediately join me in my quiet time, but I noticed he started to open up a little more. We talked about our struggles, yes, but we also talked about the future, about our dreams and hopes. Slowly, the Paul the first knew, the one who was full of life and laughter, began to re-emerge. And though we still had a long way to go, I could see that God was working in both of us, restoring not just our faith, but our connection with each other. It was during one of our walks that Paul finally admitted something that had been weighing on him. "I thought I was failing you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I thought I wasn't enough. That I was letting you down." I stopped and turned to face him, the tears already welling up in my eyes. "Paul, you've never let me down. We're in this together. God hasn't abandoned us, and neither have I." That moment, under the cool evening sky, was a breakthrough for both of us. It wasn't a miraculous resolution to all our problems, but it was a start. It was a sign that the healing had begun, not just in our circumstances, but in our hearts. We were finding our way back to each other, and more importantly, back to God. As the days turned into weeks, Paul started joining me for morning prayer. We would sit together in that same quiet corner, reflecting on the daily blessings we so often took for granted. I could see his faith growing, his spirit lifting. He smiled more, laughed more, and our home, once filled with tension and fear, was now a place of peace and joy again. It wasn't easy. Some days were still hard. But every morning, as I sat in my quiet time with the Lord, I reminded myself of how far we'd come. How even in the darkest moments, God had never left us. He had been there all along, guiding us, comforting us, and showing us the way forward. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. As Paul and I settled into our new routine, I began to realize something profound, something I hadn't expected. Through all the pain and hardship, I had found a deeper relationship with God. It was no longer just about asking for things to get better or for miracles to happen. It was about quiet moments of connection, where I could hear God's voice more clearly than I ever had before. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of peace, like a warm embrace that soothed every worry I had. It was as if God was reminding me daily that He was in control, even when everything around us seemed chaotic. One morning, as Paul and I sat in our usual spot, I could feel a shift in the air. It wasn't something I could explain in words, but it was as if God was preparing us for something new, something different. We prayed together, and as we did, Paul squeezed my hand a little tighter. When we finished, he looked at me with eyes filled with a quiet determination that I hadn't seen in months. I've been thinking, he started, his voice soft but resolute. Maybe all of this, losing my job, the struggles, it was God's way of leading me somewhere else. I didn't say anything at first, letting his words sink in. I knew exactly what he meant because I had felt the same thing stirring in my heart. Sometimes, when we're so focused on one path, God has to nudge us in a different direction, one that we never saw coming, but that he knew was meant for us all along. I want to start my own business, Paul continued. It's something I've been thinking about for years, but I was always too afraid. Too comfortable with what I had. But maybe this is the push I needed. His words were filled with hope, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the old Paul, the one who believed in possibilities, the one who trusted in divine guidance. I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming sense of gratitude. Then let's do it, I said softly. Let's trust that God has been leading us here all along. And that's exactly what we did. In the weeks that followed, we poured our energy into building something new. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt and fear, but there was also an undeniable sense of purpose guiding us. Every step felt like a leap of faith, but with each leap, we landed on solid ground. What amazed me the most wasn't the success that started to unfold, it was the change in both of us. Paul had found his joy again, and I had found a deeper sense of faith than I ever thought possible. Our relationship with each other and with God had been restored, stronger than it had ever been. We were no longer just surviving, we were thriving. One afternoon, as we sat together reviewing plans for the business, I looked at Paul and smiled. You know, I used to pray for a miracle, I said, my voice filled with emotion. But now I see that the miracle wasn't just about things getting better. The real miracle was how God used all of this to bring us closer to him. Paul nodded, his eyes glistening with understanding. You're right, he whispered. We were so focused on what we thought we needed, but God gave us exactly what we didn't know we were missing. In that moment, I felt a wave of peace wash over me, a peace that came from knowing that no matter what happened next, we were on the right path. Our lives had been transformed, not because of the circumstances, but because we had found our strength in God. Our faith had been restored, and with it, our joy. It was in those quiet moments, those times of stillness with the Lord, that everything changed. We learned to let go of fear and trust in his plan, even when we couldn't see it. And through that trust, we found not only peace but a renewed sense of purpose. We had been broken, yes, but in our brokenness, we found the light of God shining through, guiding us towards something even more beautiful than we could have ever imagined. As the business grew, so did our faith. Every success was a reminder of God's faithfulness, and every challenge was an opportunity to lean on him even more. The daily blessings we once overlooked became the foundation of our new lives, filled with gratitude, hope, and joy. We had found our way back to each other, to ourselves, and most importantly, to God. As the weeks turned into months, Paul's business started to flourish, but more than the material success, what stood out to me was the change in us. Each morning, before diving into the hustle and grind of the day, we made it a point to sit in quiet prayer, taking that quiet time with the Lord. It was something we hadn't done before all the turmoil. We'd rushed through life, letting our schedules dictate our days. Now, we let God lead them. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I found myself sitting alone in the backyard, reflecting on everything that had happened. The hardships had brought us closer to God, and in turn, closer to each other. I realized that every struggle had been a stepping stone to this moment, this profound sense of peace and gratitude that now filled my heart. The funny thing about faith is that it doesn't always come when things are easy. It's often in the midst of the storm, when everything seems to be falling apart, that we find our way back to God. And that's exactly what had happened with me. In those early days, when Paul lost his job and everything felt uncertain, I prayed for God to change our circumstances. But over time, I realized that what really needed to change was my heart. I had been so focused on what we had lost that I almost missed the beautiful transformation happening within us. One night, as I lay in bed, I whispered a prayer of thanks. Thank you, Lord, for the trials that have brought us closer to you. Thank you for the quiet moments that have allowed us to hear your voice. And thank you for the joy that comes from trusting in your plan. It was in those moments of quiet reflection that I understood something profound. God had been with us all along, even when we couldn't see it. Every challenge, every tear, every sleepless night had been part of his plan to draw us closer to him. The blessings that followed weren't just about financial stability or success. They were about the peace that comes from knowing that we are never alone, that even in the darkest moments, God's light is guiding us. One day, while Paul was out meeting with a client, I received a phone call from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. Monica, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, I've been going through a really tough time, and I didn't know who else to call. I've been feeling so lost. Her words took me back to those early days when I, too, felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. I listened as she poured out her heart, sharing her fears and frustrations. And when she was done, I said the words I wished someone had told me during my darkest days. You're not alone, I said gently. God is with you, even when you can't see it. And sometimes, the hardest seasons in life are the ones that bring us closest to Him. We talked for a while longer, and before we hung up, I offered to pray with her. As I spoke the words aloud, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. It was as if God was using me, in that moment, to be a vessel of His love and comfort for someone else. I had come full circle, from feeling lost and broken to being able to offer hope and encouragement to others. It was a reminder that even in our weakest moments, God can use us to shine His light into the lives of others. As the days continued, I noticed something else. The more I surrendered my worries and fears to God, the more peace I felt. The daily blessings that had once seemed so elusive now appeared in abundance. A kind word from a stranger, a beautiful sunset, the sound of laughter filling our home, each one was a reminder of God's goodness and grace. And as for Paul, he had found a renewed sense of purpose in his work. His faith had grown, and with it, his joy. We prayed together every night, thanking God for the journey He had taken us on, and for the way He had transformed our hearts along the way. One afternoon, as we sat together in our backyard, watching the leaves rustle in the breeze, Paul turned to me and said, I can't believe how far we've come, Monica. It feels like a miracle. I smiled, squeezing his hand. It is a miracle, I said softly. Not because everything turned out the way we hoped, but because God turned us into who we were always meant to be. We had found our way through the storm, not because the storm had ended, but because we had learned to trust the one who calms the waves. In our quiet time with the Lord, we had discovered the true meaning of faith, not the absence of difficulties, but the presence of peace in the midst of them. And that peace, that joy, that unshakable faith, it was the greatest gift we could have ever received.
Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Shrine of Lightness, and turn on notifications to keep receiving inspiring stories of faith. Together, let's open our hearts to the divine and witness the restoration comes from trusting in God.